Well, good morning. Well, I'm done, so that's all I needed. Good morning. Didn't work as well as the first one. My name is Pastor Brandon. I am the student ministry pastor around here, and I get the honor and privilege of sharing God's word with you guys this morning as well as next week. Pastor Matt is in Mexico, which means I could say whatever I want, and he will never know, so that's exciting. We've got a lot to cover this morning, so I'm going to go ahead and pray for us, and then we will dive right in as we continue in our series looking at the book of Exodus. So would you pray with me? Jesus, thank you so much for this morning, and thank you once again for the chance to gather in your name with your people. And God, I am so encouraged by the stories of life change that happen here in our church and in our community, and how you take really imperfect people and you make them new again. You change us from the inside out, and that as we gather weekly and monthly, as we gather here at church and as we meet in homes throughout the week, God, thank you that you are present in our midst, that you are a God that is involved in the lives and situations of your people. And God, as we open up your word this morning, we ask that you would help us to grow from it. We pray that this would not be a useless exercise. We pray that this would not just be another Sunday morning, but God, that something significant, something serious, something impactful would happen today. Lord, not because we're awesome, but because you're awesome, and we serve and love a really good God. And so we love you, and we pray all these things in your Son's name. Everyone said, Amen. As I mentioned, we are going to be continuing in our series looking at the book of Exodus, and I'm really excited for the next couple weeks. So if you have a Bible or if you're going to be following along, I'm going to be starting in Exodus 21 in a few minutes. We also have, I think Pastor Scott mentioned, we have our app, and there's a notes feature where you can follow along with me and fill out notes there. As a youth pastor, I've been doing summer camps for a really long time. It's really one of my favorite things about student ministries, and we actually have a camp coming up in August, which I'm really looking forward to. And it's actually also been a really big part of my life as a student. I've been going to summer camps for as long as I can remember, and they've really been a really important time for my life and my faith. There have been some really cool times of life change. God has done some really cool things in my life. But because I was a junior higher and a high schooler, there are also times where I did some really dumb things. And I heard one giggle because someone felt a story coming. And now as a youth pastor, I have a really, really serious rule that I adhere to very strongly, and that is no pranking. And the reason why I have such a strong rule for no pranking is because I pulled some really stupid pranks when I was a kid and did some really dumb things. And because it's been some years, I'm going to go ahead and share some of those with you this morning. This one camp I was at, I was a sophomore in high school. It was the very last day of camp, and I found myself in the men's restroom with two of my friends filling up water balloons. And we were crafting the perfect prank. Now, I don't know if you've ever pulled a prank before, but there are some pranks that are just dumb and lame, and then there's the perfect prank. And this, I think, was the perfect prank. We had filled up over 500 water balloons, and we had spread them out all throughout the camp. And the plan was, once the camp was ending, once everyone was grabbing their bags and heading out to the buses, that we would ambush the girls and just annihilate them, right? So we were in the bathroom filling up these water balloons, and it was the end of the planning stage. Now, mind you, the reason why we were so serious about this prank is because the girls had pranked us the night before. Now, what's dangerous about pranks is that pranks do not just end with one prank, right? There's always a prank, and then there's always a follow-up prank, and then another prank, and then someone ends up getting hurt. Right? And so the reason why we were so aggressive and excited about the prank that we were pulling is because the girls had pulled this prank on us the night before, and they had really done something really damaging to a lot of high school students. They had taken some products and poured grape juice on them and put them all over our cabin. And us guys woke up and we were just disgusted, and some of us were confused, some of us passed out. We were really just having a hard time with this. And so we thought we were going to get the girls back in the biggest way possible. And so things were going really well until they didn't. As we were finishing up the last few water balloons, one of the adult girl leaders walks by the bathroom because, of course, we had the door wide open because we're stupid high school guys. And she goes, "What are you guys doing?" And he goes, "Oh, nothing. We're just filling up some water balloons." And she goes, "Oh, you're gonna prank the girls." And so she barges into the guys' bathroom, and this is where things start to get bad. And she starts to try and pop the water balloons. And she thinks that she's gonna foil our plan, but little does she know we have hundreds throughout the camp. And so as we're kind of going through this little tussle in the men's restroom, the two guys I was with, my friend Jesse and this leader Scott, look at each other, give each other a head nod, and then one grabs her arms, the other grabs her legs, and they start to take her into the stall to give her a swirly. You guys know what a swirly is? Now, At this point, I probably should have said, no, don't do that. Guys, you're crossing a line. No, I turned into the instant hype man. Swirly, 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 right? I'm getting excited. I'm just chanting, and she's obviously screaming, no, don't. They put her like super close, and they don't actually do it, but she is obviously mortified by this whole thing. And we're laughing and high-fiving and chest bumping and grunting and doing what high school boys do, and we think that we're going to continue with this prank. So we go back to breakfast, and of course, because we're, again, stupid high school men, we are telling every single person that we gave this girl, Charlotte, a swirly, even though we never did. But we're telling everyone, oh yeah, her head was in the toilet, it was filled with poop, like we really got her. And we're just telling all these people, and we think we are just the baddest guys in camp. Now, obviously, things continue to get worse because then we get called in by the senior pastor, who happened to be my friend's dad. And before the session even starts, and he asked us what happened, and he just laid into us. And I've cried a lot in my life because I'm kind of emotional, but I'm pretty sure I've never wept harder. And he looked at the leader and said, as a leader, shame on you. He looked at his son, he said, as my son, shame on you. And then I thought, I didn't do anything. He goes, as a guest in my home, Brandon, because I was staying at their house, he goes, shame on all of you for how you acted. I want you to destroy all the water balloons. The pranking is over. And obviously we're all crying, and like we had to take an L, and it was over, right? And so our perfect plan was foiled. Now, the reason I tell this story is this: the reason why we wanted to prank them so bad, really this whole thing started from this whole idea of revenge, right? We were upset at the girls, and we wanted to get back at them. And we didn't want to just get back at them. We wanted to just get even, and we wanted to go a step further and make them feel the pain that we experienced during that time. And really, as we think about our own lives and our own journeys, the same is often true for us, right? We don't live in perfect families. We don't live in perfect neighborhoods. We don't work at perfect job sites. We all, from our earliest memories, are exposed to relationships, and we face conflict. We face tension. We face hurts from people in our lives. And it would be awesome if once those things happen, we are able to be rational, we are able to be reasonable. But how many know when something happens that we don't like, when something happens where we are offended or hurt or abused, our first response is to figure out how to get back at them or get even. And the problem often comes when we go a little bit too far in the way that we handle the things that happen in our lives. We can often create more problems than the initial problem because of our response. And so as we look at this section in Exodus this morning, we're going to be looking in part at chapters 20 through 24. This section deals with this whole idea of retribution, or getting back at someone, or handling offenses, or handling problems, or handling things that are done in our lives. While the first half of Exodus really deals with the narrative of the children of Israel, the second half of Exodus really, in large part, has to do with how God's people are supposed to live and act inside of community. And what we will find this morning is that God gives these specific instructions for his people of how to handle when things go wrong. And we're going to see that part of God's laws for his people is that he's going to give them permission to make things right, to seek retribution and fair payment for offenses that happen in the midst of everyday relationships. And while there are some things in the Old Testament that we can really take and apply directly to our lives, like for example with the Ten Commandments, most, if not all of the Ten Commandments, we can teach and apply to our lives today without much problem. What I find that it's going to be interesting about this morning's topic is that this is one of the things that we cannot do well. And in fact, Jesus himself, once we get to the New Testament, challenges and totally reinterprets this idea. But as we kind of dive into Exodus, we're going to be talking about this whole idea of fairness. And what we're going to see, hopefully, by the end of this morning is that while we may want fairness, Jesus will call us to embrace grace. And so if you are looking at your Bible or at your app, this brings us to the first point in our notes, and it's this: that God desires a just and fair society. God desires a just and fair society. I'm going to read chapter 21, verses 22 through 25. There's a lot here, but I picked out this section because I think it gives a good summary of the entire passage. It says this is God speaking to Moses to give to the people. It says, and this is super random, so get ready. It says, now suppose two men are fighting, and in the process, they accidentally strike a pregnant woman so that she gives birth prematurely. I hate when that happens. If no further injury results, The man who struck the woman must pay the amount of compensation to the woman's husband that he demands, and the judges approve. But if there is further injury, the punishment must match the injury: a life for a life, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, a foot for a foot, a burn for a burn, a wound for a wound, and a bruise for a bruise. Verse 23 again, but if there is further injury, the punishment must match the injury. So what we find in this section is that God continues to give Moses his laws for his people. Before they enter into the promised land, before they start the nation of Israel, God kind of is giving these blueprints, these laws, these regulations, these boundaries for his people to live by. And so what we find is on the heels of the Ten Commandments, he gives these continued regulations, and he gives all of these laws and regulations for them to follow. And this section, again, I think gives a good summary of the entire passage, and we see just a few things that I think are noteworthy. And the first one is this. We see that God really affirms and anticipates that there would be offenses. What I find really striking about this is that before they moved into the nation of Israel, before they had a chance to become a nation or society, he just knew in advance that there would be some offenses that would happen on a day-to-day basis. And in this section, we see that there's this hypothetical situation of two men fighting. They're brawling, they're having a fisticuff battle about something, and then there's a pregnant woman there just who happens to be watching the fight. Maybe she's like, swirly, swirly, or whatever she's doing, and then they bump into her, and then she is injured from this accident. And so we see that what's affirmed here is that God says that in the midst of society, and in the midst of relationships, and in the midst of families, and the workplace, and in your neighborhoods, there will be offenses that occur. And not just in these three or so verses, that what we see in these really 10 chapters, we see that mention are assault and kidnapping and perjury and bad loans and relationships between an employer and employee. There are all kinds of offenses in relationships that are affirmed here. And God says that I know my people, and I know that when you come into day-to-day life, there will be these things. And really the same is true for us, right? No matter what kind of family you're a part of, no matter what kind of school you go to, no matter what neighborhood you're from or what ethnicity you are, we all experience these sort of conflicts in relationship. And then the other thing that we see here is that God has some specific instructions for how to handle these offenses well. Look down again at verse 23. This is kind of a big idea. He says, but if there is further injury, the punishment must match the injury. A life for a life, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, a foot for a foot, a burn for a burn, a wound for a wound, and a bruise for a bruise. You see, what I don't think this is doing is just giving specific instructions for if your eye gets poked out, right? And only if your eye gets poked out do you get to poke out your neighbor's eye and say, see, all right, now we're even, now we both can't see, perfect. Or if someone punches you in the arm, you say, all right, come over here, let me punch you again, and then it makes it even. What I think is happening here is that God is kind of giving this framework and these boundaries for how to handle offenses well. He says that you must handle them in a way that is fair, that is proportionate, and that is balanced. And so in this section, we see that if someone is a murderer, if someone kidnaps someone, they are to be put to death. If there is a personal injury, that they're to handle it and pay for the damages that happen and make up for it. If someone steals, they are to pay it back or to be sold into slavery, et cetera, et cetera. And so we see that God creates these boundaries in society. He creates a safe environment by which we can handle offenses well and kind of deal with the things that happen on a day-to-day basis, both in the home, in the neighborhood, and in society at large. And this really, if we kind of read this at face value, this gives us this permission to make wrongs right. This kind of affirms the feeling that we get on the inside of us when we are offended, when we are hurt, when we are bruised, when someone offends us, that we automatically want to receive some sort of justice, right? This feeling is in all of us, and I think God kind of affirms this and creates the space for us. If you've ever been driving down the road with your family or with your spouse and someone cuts you off in traffic, you don't have to turn to your spouse and ask them how you're supposed to handle it. Like, what am I supposed to do here? Like, Should I say something? Or no, have you ever been cut off in traffic? No one has to Google what to do when someone cuts you off, right? Let me think about this for a second. I read in a book once that no. As soon as someone cuts you off in traffic, what do? Hey! Right? You just start yelling at them. You start to do hand motions like this. Some people give a finger, point right to Jesus, right? Only one way to the Father, one way to the Father. Or you start talking to them as if they could hear you somehow. You start reasoning with them. Excuse me, kind sir, this is a merge only lane, or whatever you do, right? When we are offended, our first response is to handle those offenses. And more than that, when we experience hardships with our family or with our bosses or with our neighbors, right, we all want to make the wrongs right. And so what I think Exodus provides for us is sort of this framework and permission to seek justice, to seek fairness, and to handle offenses in an appropriate way. But the problem is that this is often easier said than done. What we find in here is that although there are instructions for us to handle it, that God puts boundaries around them. And if I were to end the message here, I don't think anyone would really argue with me and say, yeah, I don't want to make wrongs right. I don't really want to handle offenses. Most of us want to handle the things that are done to us, but the problem is that we often aren't able to do this well. All of us have a problem that keeps us from really existing in relationships in a healthy and a fair way. And the reason is that we all have sin. This brings us to point 2 in our notes, is that sin makes fair relationships impossible. Sin makes fair relationships impossible. While we might have a desire for fairness, while we might have a desire to handle conflict well and reasonably, because we have sin, we are not able to do this as we should. James chapter 4, verses 1 through 3 reads it this way. What is causing the quarrels and fights among you? Don't they come from the evil desires at war within you? You want what you don't have, so you scheme and kill to get it. You are jealous of what others have, but you can't get it, so you fight and wage war to take it away from them. Yet you do not have what you want because you don't ask God for it. And even when you ask God, you don't get it because your motives are all wrong. You only want what gives you pleasure. You see, James kind of looks at the human condition and the human situation and points to this idea of sin. Now, if you've been in Bible study before, if you've been around the church, a common definition of sin is missing the mark. Or if there's a standard that God has, we cannot meet it, both in the things that we do and the things that we fail to do. But what James kind of affirms is that sin is more than just an external standard, that sin is often something that lives on the inside of us, that gives us this bent toward doing wrong and being selfish and self-seeking. He says, if you look at your community, if you look at your relationships, if you look at your workplace, if you look at your neighborhoods, what is causing conflict in those relationships? And James says, it's the sin that dwells on the inside of you. And so, as we're thinking about our relationships, on paper, maybe we want fairness. This seems logical, this seems doable. We actually cannot do it based on the way we live because of the sin inside of us. And really, this shows us that we need something different. But I want to talk really quick about a few ways that we pervert justice. Because as I first started kind of thinking and reflecting on this topic, I was thinking I'm pretty fair, I'm pretty reasonable, I can really handle my relationships well. But the more I thought about it and the more I reflected, I realized that this is almost impossible. And there are 3 ways that we do this together. And the first one is this. The first way that we pervert justice is that we ignore our own sin in relationships. We ignore our own sin in relationships. There's a fascinating story found in 2 Samuel chapters 11 and 12 of David and Bathsheba. And if you're familiar, basically this King David, he's at the height of his power and he's one of God's favorite kings, but he finds himself in an extramarital affair. And not only that, he kills the gal's wife in order to cover the whole thing up. He thinks he's getting away with it, and he's doing all of these bad things. And one of the most impactful parts of the story for me is found in chapter 12, where the prophet Nathan comes and confronts David in his sin. But he doesn't just do it directly. He gives him a hypothetical situation. He says, Hey, King David, I need your advice. And David says, oh, absolutely, I'd love to help you. And Nathan says, hey, there's this really rich guy. He's got all this stuff. He has everything he ever needs. And he has a poor neighbor. And the rich man has a friend come over for the weekend, and he goes and takes the neighbor's stuff. And David says, oh, this neighbor guy, he's been wronged. The rich guy needs to be killed. And Nathan looks at David and says, you are that man. And then we see in David this realization of his sin. What I find fascinating about that story is that while David was doing the wrong thing, he was sleeping with his neighbor's wife, he had killed him to cover it up. He was looking at this hypothetical situation and seeing the sin in others, but he had a hard time seeing the sin in himself. And I find the same is often true with us. While on paper, we want fairness, we want things to be reasonable, we want people to make wrongs right as long as we don't have to admit our own wrongdoings in relationships. Like, we want things to be made right as long as we don't have to do our part in it. We have an easier time seeing the wrong and the sin in others more than we can see our own sin. And in fact, we can often live with this perpetual double standard of justice where we're willing to call people on their stuff, but when it comes to our stuff, we can rationalize it or downplay it or get defensive. I can remember a while back when our son Hudson, who's almost 4, he was in the terrible twos section of his life, and he really lived up to that. And I asked him to do something. I don't know if it was, go to your room or get your jammies on or brush your teeth or just don't look at me like that. I don't know what I said to him. And he goes, no, I don't want to. He yelled at me. And I go, you do not talk to me like that. We do not yell in this family. We use our nice words, Hudson. We don't yell at each other. And I'm yelling at him. I'm lecturing him about how much we don't yell at each other in our family. And he's crying. I'm like, don't you yell at me. We don't yell at each other. Go to your room, right? Slams the door, and then I just was like, oh my goodness, right? Like, what is wrong with me, right? Because I was like, he's yelling at me, and that's not right, so I'm going to yell at him to let him know how much I don't like his yelling, right? How often do we do this? How often do we see something in our siblings or our parents or our spouse or our neighbor or our boss where we're like, that's wrong, I need to make that right. I need to tell them what they're doing that's absolutely wrong. But then when the same thing gets pointed in our direction, we're quick to rationalize and justify and downplay. How often do we fight for our own rights, but fail to fight for the rights of others? Because to truly be fair in this way would be to hold ourselves accountable. And because of our sin, we have a really hard time doing this. The second way we pervert justice is that we go overboard in seeking retribution. We go overboard in seeking retribution. So if we're looking at God's standard, we're saying like the punishment must match the injury, right? An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, a foot for a foot. If someone injures you or wrongs you in one way, then we are to have the retribution or the payment match exactly what the injury was. And this, again, sounds good in theory, but this is really hard to do because of our sin and selfishness. There's a story in John chapter 18 where Jesus and his disciples are in the Garden of Gethsemane, and the guards come to arrest Jesus, and Peter pulls out his sword, and he tries to defend himself, and he ends up cutting off the ear of one of the high priest's guards. And I love this story because Peter has really bad aim, and he's like I imagine him being this like dorky guy trying to cut someone's head off, and chops off his ear. But what I find in that is that this is just an overreaction. Like, Jesus didn't want to be defended. Like, he didn't want to even go through due process. He took out a sword to try and take matters into his own hands and ends up kind of overdoing what he was supposed to do. And I find that is often true in our own lives as well. When we're thinking about our lives, when we're thinking about our relationships, when we're thinking about the offenses that we experience in our lives, how easy is it for us to go overboard in seeking retribution? When we are in conflicts, they are extremely emotional, and we have a hard time being objective, we have a hard time being reasonable, we have a hard time being rational, and often we go overboard in our actions, in our attitudes, with our words, and we end up causing more damage than was originally created. I saw in the news the other day that there was a woman whose husband was having an affair, And while you maybe hear some of these stories often about, the person seeking a divorce or trying to, take some of the things from the house, this woman goes to the other woman's house in a different state, hides in waiting, and kills both of them, both people and herself. She totally messed up her life and killed other people as a way to get back at them, right? This is an extreme situation, but here's the deal. How often do we do this? How often is there a situation in our lives where we know we've been wronged, and instead of saying, how might I handle this in the right way, do we go overboard? I have too many stories to share about times where someone has offended me, and my first thought is not, okay, I want to do this right, I want to handle this in God's way. I think, how do I make their lives miserable, right? How do I go overboard in retribution? And have you ever done this? Have you ever withheld affection from someone, or spread rumors about another person, or orchestrated events so that they feel the same things you do, or if they did something to you, you do the exact same to them and worse, right? We all are guilty of this, and it's because of our sin. And the last one, number 3, the way we pervert justice is that we keep score. We keep score. There's a story in 1 Samuel 25 of, again, David, but this time is with this guy named Nabal and Abigail. And basically, in short, David and his men protect this guy, Nabal's shepherds and some of his stuff. And in return, he comes to Nabal and asks him for help in return. And Nabal, we learn that he's a rich fool who's a drunk as well. He really turns down David and says, I'm not going to do it. And David, in return, then gets really mad at Nabal and threatens to kind of take out his whole family. Right? Because really, David was really only treating Nabal in a certain way so that he might get something from him. And when he didn't return the favor, then he just kind of raged at him. And this is often, I find, true for our own lives, that sometimes we only treat people well if we think they deserve it, or in order to get something in return. We're always keeping score. We make ourselves the judge in our relationships to say, I want to keep things fair and balanced, so I'm only going to do something for you as long as it's even, right? Have you ever had this happen when your parents or your spouse says, hey, can you take out the trash? And you say, it's not my turn, right? I did it last time. Or if you're that spouse or that child, you say, I actually took out the last 6 of 7 times, so you owe me 5, right? Or whatever it is. Or someone says, hey, can you take me to the airport? Or can you help me move? And you think in your head, well, you know what, actually, I asked you to do it. I asked you to take me to the airport, and you said no, so this time I'm not going to help you, right? How often do we do this? Do we keep this eternal balance sheet to say, look, I'm only going to help you out if it benefits me or if I think you deserve it, but because of our sin in relationships, it is never even, and we will always be wanting more. And what is the result of all this, right? If we're thinking about our relationships, and maybe for starters, when we're thinking about this whole idea of fairness, maybe you're like, yeah, that sounds reasonable, that sounds right, that sounds doable. But as we reflect a little bit deeper, we realize that, man, it's really hard to actually live like this. And the result of this, honestly, is just broken relationships. We have broken and fractured relationships as we treat people poorly, as we hold on to offenses, as we seek retribution in extreme ways, and as we eternally keep score. And it's clear that we cannot do this well. And really, when we come to back to the story of Exodus and we look at the children of Israel, what is pretty fascinating about this is that they agreed to do this. This section that we read in chapter 21 is part of the larger Old Testament law. And at the end of this section, Moses says, if you will do these things, God will bless you. If you follow God's laws, he will be with you. He will bless you and keep you and multiply you. And the children of Israel said, yes, we will do this. But if you look through the rest of the Old Testament and see the rest of their story, we find that they do not do this. Isaiah chapter 1, verses 21 through 23 say, see how Jerusalem, once so faithful, has become an unfaithful person. And once the home of justice and righteousness, she is now filled with murderers. Your leaders are rebels, the companions of thieves. All of them love bribes and demand payoffs, but they refuse to defend the cause of the orphans or fight for the rights of the widows. So what we find throughout the rest of the story of the children of Israel is that they didn't do this as well. While they promised to God that they would handle their relationships well, they just didn't. They couldn't do it, and it produced in them broken and fractured relationships. And this didn't work for them. It doesn't work for us. And really, this points us and hopefully creates in us a longing for a different way. And that is ultimately found through Jesus. And the last point in your notes is simply this: Jesus calls us to resist fair and embrace grace. Jesus calls us to resist fair and embrace grace. When we come to the New Testament, and specifically in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus begins to paint this picture of relationships in a different way. He says that, look, the Old Testament law didn't work. We weren't able to fulfill it. We had too much sin inside of us to serve God in the right way. And basically, he tells us that we are able to now have a relationship with God that is better and different and is now based on grace. And what's really cool and what's really exciting about the New Testament and about the story of Jesus is that he tells us that we no longer have to seek God through what we do. We no longer have to live through the law. And what's really cool and exciting to me, and what's really exciting about the story of Christianity, is that coming to Jesus isn't fair, right? If we're thinking about our own relationships, sometimes we want fair because it seems logical. But what we find about the story of Christianity is that it is the furthest thing from fair. In Romans chapter 5, it tells us that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Ephesians chapter 2 says that we are saved by grace through faith, not of works, so that no one can boast. And so if you are a Christian in here, if you believe in Jesus, you know that you came to God through Jesus, not because of anything you did, but because of grace of God. And so as we're even reflecting on our own faith, do you realize that becoming a Christian isn't fair? That if we were to kind of keep a tally of our own relationship with God, you will know that the marks on our account in the negative side far outweigh the positive marks in our account. That God loved us despite ourselves. And that the second thing we see is that our relationships are called to be marked by the same grace. Look with me at Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 through 42, and it'll also be on the screen behind you. Look what Jesus says. He says, you have heard the law that says the punishment must match the injury, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I say, do not resist an evil person. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, offer the other cheek also. If you are sued in court and your shirt is taken from you, give your coat too. If a soldier demands that you carry his gear for a mile, carry it 2 miles. Give to those who ask, and don't turn away from those who want to borrow. Now, when we read this initially, without the context of Exodus, if we just see this seems illogical. This actually seems kind of stupid, right? It says if someone punches you, if someone slaps you, just turn the other cheek. If someone resists you or someone offends you, don't try and get even or get revenge. If someone sues you for your belongings, don't even put up a fight to resist them. Just give them your stuff. If someone asks for your help and it's kind of an unfair, unjust situation, like offer more help. If someone's asking you for assistance and they don't deserve it, if they are begging for help, don't look at what's fair. Just do it. And again, at first glance, this seems really dumb. But when we look at this in the framework of our relationship with Jesus, this really only makes sense. Because when we really reflect on God's grace for us, when we really reflect on the way in which we become a Christian, when we really reflect on how much God has forgiven us, how much he has loved us, how much he has shown us grace, it only makes sense for our relationships to be filled with this sort of grace. He calls us to choose forgiveness over aggression. Here's the deal. If someone offends you, if someone mistreats you, what Jesus calls us to do is to resist aggression, is to not even try and make things quote unquote right, but to offer them forgiveness. Now, this seems crazy, but how many times do we get in these situations and our first response is to get back? But Jesus says, look. In the same way that I have forgiven you, I want you to forgive others. I say this often, but Jesus offers us kind of this divine comparison. He says, if you look at how much I have forgiven you, I want you to compare it with the offenses that you have. And he says, you can forgive others because I have forgiven you. The second thing he says is that we are to return good for evil. He says, when people treat us poorly, when people talk bad about us, when people badmouth us, when people try and take advantage of us, we don't have to return that evil for evil. He says we can actually treat them good and well in response to that. Because it's the same thing that even when we are faithless, even when we are sinners, even when we fall astray, God continues to love us and care about us no matter how we act or no matter what we do, and we can do the same thing. And really this last idea is one of my favorites. He says that we can love and serve others willingly without expecting anything in return. He says that when you see someone in need, you don't have to say, do they deserve it? Am I going to get something back? We can serve others willingly. And so what I want you to think about for yourself as we're kind of wrapping up here is two things for you to think about. The first one is this: have you received this grace? Do you call yourself a Christian? Have you received God's love and grace and forgiveness? And if the answer is yes, I want you to then reflect on what would it look like for you to resist fair and embrace grace. What would it look like for you with your siblings, with your parents, with your coworkers, with your neighbors, to say, look, maybe there's a situation where my first response is to get back and get even, but man, because of God's grace, I am allowed to return grace in this situation. This will not always be easy. This will not always be our first response, but I believe that this creates something beautiful and grace-filled when we are actively showing God's love in our relationship. This allows God's changing power to come on the inside of us and provide this beautiful story of redemption as God shows us his love in our lives and we are able to show it to others. I'm going to end with a story from a couple from our church. Dave and Lynn Wells are faithful members of our church and a great example of, in a lot of ways. And a couple weeks ago, they came and spoke to our students and shared part of their marriage and their story. And in that, they kind of shared part of their journey that I thought was really encouraging to me, and I think really speaks to the situation well. So these are Lynn's words about something that they went through and how they kind of learned this idea. So let me read it. It says, Dave and I were married in September of 1994. We committed to love, honor, and cherish each other for better or for worse, in sickness and in health. But like the first page of a new book, we dove in and didn't have a clue what was ahead. In those early years, we hadn't yet faced a defining moment, that moment when you look into the eyes of the person you've married and truly discover what your relationship is made of. Sure, we had experienced some disappointments and had wrestled with big decisions like where to work and where to live, but God had not yet shown us suffering. He hadn't yet shown us what sacrificial love could look like. He hadn't yet given us a chance to daily serve each other, really truly serve each other. Until 2002, he hadn't yet allowed painful grief and aggressive cancer to change everything, including us. But then he did, and we are so grateful that he did. On our 8th wedding anniversary in September of 2002, I was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma. The doctor said it was the most aggressive collection of deadly and uncontrollable cells they'd seen in their careers, and we were in for a battle. And back then, we had 2 very little, very active toddlers. The timing of the news was even more difficult than the news itself because my precious mom had just passed away only 7 weeks before my diagnosis. She had died from cancer, and now I had cancer. We didn't know how this story would end, but Dave and I both had the confidence in our souls that God would bring beautiful things out of this misery, and he did. He showed me Jesus and the love and generosity of others, and he gave me comfort when the grief of my mom's death was literally paralyzing. He gave me strength when the nausea from the chemotherapy choked my entire body. In addition to these daily reminders of God's faithful love during the suffering, I saw up close just what amazing man I had married. Dave and I faced everything together: surgery, chemotherapy, radiation, hair loss, fatigue, endless doctor's appointments, and continual nausea. We cried and grieved over my mom. We unplugged the calendar of life. We were quiet, and surprisingly, we would often just let go and laugh at ourselves. We experienced the most enriching days of our marriage. Dave could have never known back in 1994 when I walked down the aisle that one day he would be serving me so fully and selflessly. He didn't know that one day that girl in that white gown would be unable to lift herself out of bed, that one day she would be an utter mess, that on his own he would be working a full-time job while also taking care of 2 kids and all the laundry, the errands, the finances, the cleaning, the shopping, walks to the park, bath time and bedtime, all while keeping his sanity and strength. He truly served me and our family when not one of us could possibly serve him back. He never kept score. He always got up the next day and lived the same faithful life over and over again. I'm sure it was really a sight. Dave would wake up with me at 2 or 3 in the morning during a massive wave of nausea. Then we would look down and see clumps of hair scattered and lying on my pillow. So attractive, right? But in a way, it was an incredible, beautiful thing to be that sick, that unpresentable, that utterly exhausted, and for Dave to look at me and say, "I love you." I think Dave's energy and passion to serve me wasn't some Superman stunt. This wasn't about him just sticking it out and being heroic. It was so much more than that. I think he really dug down deep into his soul and realized that this was exactly what God had called him to do, to lay down his own life and serve one another. And he did that, and his energy was multiplied. Are you kidding me? Is anything about that fair? Right? Is it right? She said it herself, like he served not to get something in return, not because they could serve him back, but he just served. He loved and he poured out his life for his family. And the reason I use this story is not necessarily for us to look at Dave or to look at Lynn and say, man, like that, they're just these heroes up in the sky and we should just kind of admire them and look at them. But I think this is a powerful picture of what our lives and our relationships can look like when we truly embrace grace. When we're able to say, I'm going to return good when someone treats me evil. I'm going to forgive people that don't deserve it, and I'm going to serve my friends. I'm going to serve my family. I'm going to serve my spouse. I'm going to serve those in my community, not because I can get anything from it, but because Jesus has loved me in the same way. I'm going to pray in a second, and we're going to get ready to take communion. But as we get ready to pass the elements, I want you to think about this whole idea of Christianity being this unfair thing. I want you to think and reflect on the fact that God has loved you when you didn't deserve it, that truly he has shown you grace despite all that you have done. So let me go ahead and pray, and then the elements will come. Lord, thank you so much for your grace, and thank you for your forgiveness, and thank you for stories of life change that can happen in our lives. And God, I don't know every situation in here. I don't know every family story. I don't know every work situation. I don't know every marriage crisis, but what I do know is that we all get offended. Some of us have things maybe that are even weighing on our heads and our hearts right now that we're thinking, man, like I'm just upset. Like the words that they have spoken to me, the things that they have done to me, the situations that they have manipulated, like I just feel as if I need to fight for my rights in this situation or in this circumstance or with my parents or with my in-laws, whatever it may be. But God, I pray that even right now that we would begin to remember and reflect all that you have done for us through your son, Jesus, that you showed us love, that you showed us mercy, that you showed us forgiveness, that you showed us all the things that we needed when we didn't deserve it, when we couldn't pay you back. And all we have to do is just accept it. And so, Lord, as we reflect on those things, as we get ready to come to your table and reflect on your sacrifice for us, I pray that our partaking of communion wouldn't just stop with us. It would not just be just something that we partake internally and it lets us kind of change our lives, but I pray that it would be something that would be external, that we would then take that same love and that same grace and that same passion and that same experience and we would pour it out in our relationships, and that we would, again, resist fair and embrace grace. We love you so much. We pray that this moment would be serious and impactful. In Jesus' name.